the session to make sure we have that for folks who are going to watch us later. Good afternoon and welcome to today's structured conversation. My name is Carrie Klima and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SAL Professional Development Committee, I want to thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to today's guest speakers. And a little bit of verbiage off of my script that I typically do. We really want to thank you all for joining today. We know that this is a trying time, and we were having a bit of a conversation before about it is kind of nice to have a webinar that isn't about our pandemic right now. So we're really happy that you're here today, and we're excited to explore this topic with our presenters. A few logistics before we get started. We will have an opportunity for engagement and discussion throughout the conversation. Most of the time we'll be using the chat box just because there are quite a few folks on here, and I think we all are really used to Zoom or WebEx conferencing software now, so we know how much when we have a lot of participants on, kind of unmuting and muting can be a bit difficult. So we'll try to use the chat as much as possible for our discussion. And I encourage you to post questions, to share comments, and provide feedback throughout this conversation. And let's go ahead and get started with our conversation. Today's topic is unpacking and resisting neoliberalism in student affairs assessment with Kyle Ashley and Vince Nick. And as a result of this conversation, participants will possess agency to recognize neoliberalism, extrapolate the effects of neoliberalism onto professional roles, and advocate for a mindful resistance. And so as we get started, I will turn it over to our presenters, Kyle and Vince.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie. As Carrie shared, my name is Kyle Ashley. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am currently a full-time stay-at-home dad. So I like to say that I'm a recovering higher ed professional. But I also do some writing on the side in my spare time when my daughter's napping. And I'll share a little bit about some of the pieces that I've written related to neoliberalism. And I just graduated in May from Miami University with my PhD in student affairs and higher education. So that's a little bit about me.
And so my name is Vince, and I am a 20-year veteran in student affairs higher ed administration. I am on a tenure track position now, teaching higher ed leadership, teaching education leadership, not specifically higher ed, for doctoral students, totally online. So not a lot has changed for me right now in terms of the online world, but I did begin school and worked my way up from RA all the way through pretty much every position you can imagine. And I have loved every minute of it. And so, Kyle, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think both Dr. Nix and I share a love and a passion for student affairs. And I think that's one thing that kind of brought us together around this idea of neoliberalism, because I think it's an issue that we've both discovered through our careers as maybe jeopardizing this field that we cared so deeply about. And so we really want to start a conversation about it, because I think for us, you know, we can't really imagine what some of the possibilities for solutions might be until we start a conversation. So I think for us, you know, as Carrie said, we have kind of three big outcomes that we're shooting for today. But I think above all, we're just kind of hoping to start a conversation. And so to sort of set the scene and really put things into context before we jump into it, I wanted to share this quote from Dr. Sam Musaeus, who is a professor of education studies at UC San Diego. He has published over 200 publications and has hundreds of conference presentations. He's very renowned and just has written extensively in the field. And a few months back, once I started really digging into this idea of neoliberalism, I did an interview with him. And one of the things that he said is that he thinks that there's any urgent conversation that needs to be had right now in higher education, it's the one about neoliberalism. And he actually is shifting much of his research and scholarly attention to focus on the idea of neoliberalism because he thinks that's so important. And if you'll notice too, when I say that word neoliberalism, I often have to like slow down and pause to even say the word, because I stumble and my tongue gets twisted saying the word. And so I think in some ways that's kind of like a subtle hint to some of the ways that we can actually resist against neoliberalism, is to slow down and pause. But if you stumble with saying that word as well, you're not alone, because I think, and this is something that Dr. Nix and I have talked about, it's sort of intentionally confusing and difficult and heady. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, the quote from Dr. Macias to kind of set the stage. So I think for me, as I started looking into this idea of neoliberalism, it was helpful for me to kind of take a step back and really look at what led me to the field of student affairs. So I thought that might be a helpful place for us to start in thinking about where we are now and how this dynamic of neoliberalism is impacting our field, to really backtrack first and kind of look at what got us into the field in the first place, as a way to kind of make sense of where we are now. And so I want to invite folks who are on the call to maybe in the chat box just share a little bit about what led you to the field of student affairs. What caused you to want to become a student affairs professional, to work with students, to work in a college setting. And Dr. Nix and I are going to share our personal stories, and maybe that will help to inspire some folks to share their stories. But for me, my story began at the University of Michigan when I was an undergraduate student, and I was an RA, and that was sort of my entry into the field, was to being a resident assistant. And I was one of those RAs that was really involved with my community. If I wasn't studying or in class, you can bet I was spending time with my residence hall community. I had about 90 folks on my hall, and we did everything from open mic nights together to intramural sports and Foursquare tournaments. We had rap battles. We did just about everything that you can think of. And for me, it was one of the most profound leadership moments of my life up until that point, because I had never been in a place where I could facilitate that kind of community for folks. And so it really gave me that sense of purpose that I had never really had before. And as an undergraduate student, I was studying philosophy and political science. And so when I got to my senior year, I didn't really know what I wanted to do for my career after school. I had thought maybe I would go to law school, because that's pretty much what a lot of other folks who were studying philosophy and political science were doing. It was about the only sort of viable real career from philosophy was to go to law school. But I'm a first generation college student, and I really didn't have any context for what going to law school meant. Hence why I didn't even start thinking about it until my senior year. But I started looking into it and realized, after finding out that I had to take the LSAT and finding out how much money it was going to cost, again, being a first generation college student, that law school just was not really going to be an option for me. And so I passed on going to law school, and I sat down with my mentor at the time, who was my hall director through my RA role. And he said, Kyle, you seem to really enjoy this RA thing. And he said, you're pretty good at it. And, I could really see you having a future doing this kind of thing. And I kind of gave him a quizzical look, like, what do you mean a future doing this? And he said, well, there's a profession called student affairs. And my jaw just kind of hit the ground. I had no idea that this was a thing that you could do as a career. And so he explained, you can go to graduate school, and a lot of times they will give you a stipend and pay for your tuition. And again, as a first generation college student, this was music to my ears. I could go and get a master's degree, an advanced professional degree, and they would pay my way to do that. And so, I was convinced, and put in my application for graduate school, and I ended up going to the Colorado State University, the program at Colorado State University. And so that's really what got me into the field. And I'm eager to hear Dr. Nix's story too, because I've heard a little bit, but I feel like there's going to be some good stuff there too. So I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you, Dr. Ashley. I don't know how good it'll be, but I began Ole Miss as an adult student with a disability. And so it was before ADA. I was in a wheelchair. But if you imagine the word woke and think of everything opposite from that, that would describe me. And so my RA was a young man, and he was from a Mideastern country. And so automatically, I probably didn't respect him much, but I got in trouble. And my introduction to student affairs was getting written up by this RA. And my hall director had to meet with me. And I had to stay in school, I had to meet with both of them every week for a semester. They eventually got through to me. And so when I started thinking about why did I want to come into student affairs, the first thing that popped into mind was I wanted to pay it forward. So and then I remembered, wait, I blogged about that a few years ago, and I looked, it was in November 2013, and I was pleased because I wrote in the post, I wanted to pay it forward. And so that really has been a consistent theme about why I went into student affairs for my entire career. And many of the stories I hear from student affairs professionals are the same. There was an emotional connection with someone, just as Dr. Ashley said. There's an emotional connection with someone in the field, and we, for example, making an I statement, I was literally transformed. And so there's not, I've worked in a lot of different things. There aren't that many opportunities to be completely transformed as a student other than through connection or affiliation with someone who really cares about students. And that's what student affairs, we attract people who want to make differences in people's lives. And I think it's important to remember that emotional connection, because neoliberalism, and I need to slow down when I say that word too, takes those emotional connections away from us in the end. So I, like Kyle, sociology was one of my interests. I double majored in sociology and psychology, and I was accepted into sociology grad school, but I was also learning how to speak Japanese, and I was fortunate enough to be selected to be the Japanese language person to present on Honors Day at Ole Miss. And some Japanese guys heard me talking and offered me a job that day. And so I left higher ed because they offered me more money than I thought I would ever make, and worked in advanced manufacturing. And that's why I have a little bit different perspective on things, because I have almost a dozen years working in advanced manufacturing outside. But I came back to higher ed because I missed the potential connections with students. There's not an opportunity to do what we do in student affairs outside student affairs, I don't feel. Even as an instructor, I get to do a lot of things, affect a lot of leadership styles, but still in student affairs, we get a whole bunch of opportunity. And so I could go forever, but it's the emotional connection, paying it forward. Back to you, Dr. Ashley.
Yeah, so I'm curious, Carrie, what are some of the things that folks shared in the chat?
We have, just to summarize, Renee is helping me out on the back end, behind the scenes. A lot of people are talking about that they got involved in the field because of a profound passion, and also because of the diverse and unique life experiences, I think, for themselves and for the students in which they work with. People found a home away from home, particularly when they were programming and connecting to programming. A lot of folks relating to you in regards to the first generation student experience, as well as the connecting because they want to have that, they have the desire to help students. So passion, connection, connection to life experiences. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at with the summary. Thank you everyone for sharing.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so when I have this conversation with other student affairs professionals, there's a lot of common things that come up, and I think some of them are ones that you all shared, and others are you know, maybe a little different. But one of the common ones is around having a mentor who sort of led folks to the field, and so I shared a little bit about my mentor. And, you know, this is a very common story that I hear, you know, oh, I had a mentor who told me that student affairs is a profession and told me about grad school and kind of helped show me how to work through that process. And so, you know, for me, not only was the mentor piece important because they told me about the field, but also because my mentor saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. My mentor saw in me that I had some skills and something valuable to contribute to the world, and he really saw me contributing that through the work that I was doing as an RA. And so That was really important for me. And I think it is for other folks as well. Another really common thing that comes up is around literature. And so for me, this didn't actually come until I was in graduate school. But the idea of seeing yourself in literature, whether it's an academic article or a book, just the idea that literature and research and scholarship can kind of capture an idea in a way that maybe hasn't really been available in other formats before. And so for me, like I said, this came when I was in graduate school, and I read Michael Kimmel's Skyland. And so this is a book about college masculinity, and it was really the first time I'd ever read anything about masculinity, and it put into words a phenomenon around manhood that I had experienced my whole life, but I didn't have language for. And I'd experienced my whole life because it was something that never resonated with me. I grew up in rural Michigan where people have big trucks and go hunting. And I was always more interested in, philosophy and music and poetry and art. And so when I read Skyland, it really opened my eyes to this whole language around masculinity. And I think in terms of my career, it gave me a place, and it gave me a direction for where I could focus myself within social justice work in higher education. So after I read Skyland, I realized, oh, so social justice is a really important value for our field, and I can contribute to that work by working with other men around these ideas of healthy masculinity and trying to unpack toxic masculinity. And so that was a really important introduction to the field for me around literature. And then the last thing that I often hear is around connection. And so Carrie mentioned this, Dr. Nix mentioned this. So this could also look like helping other people, helping students, creating community. I think very often student affairs provides opportunities for us to create connection, create opportunities for folks to show up and be their authentic selves. I think other fields obviously have an opportunity. This can happen anywhere, but again, for me and my experience, and from what I hear from other folks, this is a really common one, and the environment of higher education provides lots of different touch points and opportunities for people to be connected, to find connection, and so that's another really big one. And so when I zoom out and think about all of the things that bring folks to the field, it's really about being known and knowing. So knowing yourself, having opportunities to reflect, to think about who you are in the world, and to know others, right? To know who other people's are, what their stories are. It's that emotional connection that Dr. Nix was talking about. These are kind of the moments that we really try and aim for in our field. We try to cultivate for students, opportunities for them to know who they are in the world, and to know other people and what their experiences are. And so this seems to be true for lots of folks. And like I said, for me, that definitely has been true. And, I want to acknowledge also that our field isn't perfect. We have a lot of work to do around inclusion and social justice. And my ability to show up in student affairs and be my authentic self and create community for people, I think is a reflection of my privilege. And certainly there are a lot of folks who don't feel like they can do that in our field currently and presently. But I do think one thing that is unique about our field is that we have a commitment to that value of social justice, a commitment to that value of inclusion. And so even though we know we're not perfect at creating welcoming and inclusive spaces all the time, I think oftentimes we at least have a commitment to try and do that better on a regular basis. And so I also think, as Carrie shared from some of the responses, that is also a reason why some people come to our field, is that value of diversity and inclusion and social justice. And so that really, I think, speaks to me in terms of my own experience about coming into the field, but then also other people and why we come to this work. And I think that's important context because once we start getting into where we are now, it's important to remember where we came from and why we ended up here in this field in the first place. And so if I reflect on my career broadly and the progression of my career, I started off as an RA. I went to graduate school, and then I went to my first professional position. I was a program coordinator where I was working really closely with students, doing a lot of that one-on-one work with students. And then from there, I had several jobs where I kind of progressed up into more leadership positions and more of that mid-level position. And I realized at some point that I was getting further and further away from that connection work that I really got into the field to do in the first place. That more of that one-on-one work with students was less a part of my job. And I started looking around at my colleagues and noticed that it was less of their work as well. And then, I was observing my leadership, the administrative positions, folks who were ahead of me in upper level administration, VPSAs, those folks, and realizing that there was even less of the connection work for them. It seemed like they were spending most of their time doing crisis management and dealing with emergency response and a lot of these really difficult sort of HR cases and case management, all of these things that I think many of us are very familiar with. Assessment, so much assessment, trying to collect data and sort of justify what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And in my experience, those things were not why I got in the field. I didn't get into the field to do those high stress and high pressure aspects of the work. And that's not to say that doing those things can't be joyful and meaningful and purposeful. Certainly they can. And I think one of the things that Dr. Nix and I are going to advocate for in resisting neoliberalism is actually being able to find purpose and meaning and joy amidst some of these pressures that we're facing. But as I experienced myself, there was one point in my career where I was experiencing pretty intense insomnia because I was just working so hard all the time. I was having very little joy and passion in my work. And so as I progressed in my career, I got to a point where I was just wondering, is this just me? Am I the only one who's not finding connection in my work anymore? And so, as I said, this past spring, I graduated with my PhD, and I had an opportunity to kind of step back and just do some thinking about the field and investigate some of the questions that I had. And so I put a call out to the Student Affairs Facebook page, as well as to my professional networks, just asking folks who are doing work in the field, what are the top issues that are on the minds of student affairs professionals going into the academic year? And the responses that I got back were just overwhelming in terms of the themes, and what came through was all around people feeling stress, anxiety, pressure. And from the responses I got, I kind of analyzed all the data and put it together in the top 10 issues that student affairs professionals were thinking about, and I called it the Student Affairs State of Affairs. And those 10 issues were around campus safety, mental health, white supremacy and free speech, the diminishing value of the college degree, shrinking budgets, declining student enrollment, tuition costs going up, student loan debt increasing, the increased demands on student affairs professionals, and staff turnover rates. And certainly there are more. The list could go on. But probably as you reflected from hearing some of those issues, none of them really are about connection. None of them are really about this meaningful, purposeful, joyful work that we got into the field for in the first place. They're about high pressure, high stress, doing more with less, all of these really high pressure, high stress things that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And so what I found in putting together that piece, that essay, was that student affairs professionals are very concerned about their students, they're very concerned about their institutions, and they're very concerned about their jobs. Really, it kind of, just to sum it all up, is that I think student affairs professionals are feeling disconnected from their work. They're feeling disconnected from what led them to the work in the first place. And so I actually stumbled upon a quote from Parker Palmer, who is kind of an educational philosopher, that I think really sums it up well. He says, "Educators often suffer from the pain of dismemberment. On the surface, this is the pain of people who thought they were joining a community, but find themselves in distant, competitive, and uncaring relationships with colleagues and students. Deeper down, this pain is more spiritual than social. It comes from being disconnected from our own truth, from the passions that took us into education, from the heart that is the source of all good in the work." And again, I don't think it's so mutually exclusive. I don't think everybody feels so disconnected from the joy and passion that got us into this field in the first place. But I do think, speaking from my own experience, this was something I experienced more and more as I got further along into the career. And I do think other folks are experiencing this as well. And so as I started doing more research into what's behind this, what causes these pressures to surface for student affairs professionals, I stumbled upon this idea of neoliberalism. And it was an idea that I had heard in graduate school in my PhD, but it really wasn't something that I ever really understood or took the time to understand. It was something that I found to be really confusing. Just the term itself, it kind of sounds like this heady and philosophical idea that kind of hard to wrap your head around. And so I always kind of just wrote it off and didn't really investigate it too much. And on the surface, again, when I heard it, it kind of sounded like something related to maybe bipartisan politics. Depending on what your politics are, if you're a liberal, it might sound like something good. If you're not liberal, then maybe it's something bad. But either way, it's kind of confusing and vague. And so I really felt like I needed to explore it further to understand, all of these high pressure and high stress things that are facing student affairs professionals today. If this is the thing that's behind it, then what is this thing all about? And so I actually started getting connected to different scholars in the field who are thinking about this idea of neoliberalism. And that's when I met Dr. Vince Nix. And he is a professor at Lamar University in Texas. And one of the first conversations that we had was through LinkedIn, and it was related to a blog post that I wrote, that one of the essays that I had mentioned. And he said, neoliberalism isn't new and there's nothing liberal about it. And when I read that, I just thought, wow, this guy has some insight about this idea of neoliberalism, because I think in some ways, that's exactly what I first thought it was maybe something new and something having to do with liberal politics. And so when he said this, I was like, oh, I got to talk to this guy more because he knows some things about this topic. And so with that, I'm going to actually hand it over to Dr. Nix, and he's going to kind of help walk us through neoliberalism and help us unpack it and understand it a little bit better.
So thank you, Dr. Ashley. Great stuff you're talking about here. So the name is really interesting. Neo does mean new, but it's classical liberalism revitalized by President Carter and Reagan, then over in UK, Callahan and Thatcher, and then in China, Deng Xiaoping. Liberalism here does not mean, like most of us think liberal is social, right? We're open-minded. But liberalism here is in the sense of free trade, free markets, allowing humans to flourish globally. The term's all about economics, but the name, and I think it's intentional, confuses people into believing that it's a just philosophy. It's constructed with explicit rhetoric of individual liberty, technological innovation through transnational collaborations promoting peace, prosperity for all peoples everywhere. And that's how I got into the term. I was doing dissertation research living in China for 6 years on transnational education. And looking at how that came about, and the academic capitalism movement necessarily became connected to the neoliberalism philosophy. And so I began to look at that through the rest of my research and the rest of my practice. Oliver Thorne is a guy that does videos on YouTube and is active on Twitter. And I love his quote. He says, neoliberalism is the twisted love child of liberalism and capitalism. Would you, right, there we go. So I do prefer this definition though, because it uses the term fate and it refers to justice. And as Dr. Ashley's been saying, we are concerned about social justice, right? So the words used by the neoliberalism philosophy often conceal more than they elucidate. The free market sounds like a natural system that might bear upon us equally. It's like gravity or atmospheric pressure, but it's fraught with power relations. And what the market wants tends to mean what the corporations and their bosses want. Investment is another term, but it means two extremely critically different things. One is funding productive and socially useful activities. Another is the purchase of existing assets to milk them for rent, interest, dividends, and capital gains. And when I use the same word for different activities, that camouflages the sources of wealth. It hides those, and it leads us to confuse wealth extraction with wealth creation. Now, if we are straight, able, Caucasian men, the market works for us, and it always has in this country. Back to my roots in sociology, C. Wright Mills, in his classic work, came up with a construct called the sociological imagination. And one of the most common examples I can think of the sociological imagination pertains to unemployment. If I'm facing unemployment, I'll probably look in the mirror and I'll feel defeated, depleted, and discouraged. And I'll say, I didn't work hard enough. I didn't try hard enough. And then I think back to another construct from Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic. And so we go on next, please. Wendy Brown, in her book, Undoing the Demos, and I really can't recommend this book enough. Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution. She distinguishes between Marxist critiques of capitalism and neoliberalism. In the former, the commodification is extended and everything is monetized. But in the latter, even non-wealth generating areas of our lives are submitted to market metrics. Everything is governed by market techniques and practices. Learning, dating, exercising, and any other private areas of our lives are monitored, measured, and assessed. People are nothing more than human capital, and we must constantly and consistently create our own present and future values through entrepreneurial activities. So neoliberalism shifts the focus to speculative value, ratings, ranking. Potential values are more important than immediate value. Think about blog monetization, Twitter followers, college rankings, bond ratings. The outcomes of this neoliberalist philosophical policies are extreme inequalities of wealth, disposable populations, and then intimate relationships between finance capital and state. Now, this creates a commercialization of constructs that were previously protected from the markets. Things like human organs, things like wildlife areas filled with endangered species, and now disposable Aboriginal peoples. As the market generates, a market should generate good through individual activity and for individuals. A democracy, though, includes political deliberations for and by people and groups. So these concepts are erased, people and groups, the good, common good, public good. These concepts are erased in a neoliberal framework of individual and speculative worth. Next, please. So I like Kyle's definition as we continued our conversation. He said, he proposed that neoliberalism is the belief that social services like education should be controlled by corporations and sold to the highest bidder. So we can go back again, sociology. Talcott Parsons talked about socialization and the internalization of norms as a form of social control. Anthony Giddens referred to this as practical consciousness. That's the taken for granted, non-discursive practices of everyday life. And then Goffman talked about how powerful these interactions are in enforcing norms also. So we can go to the next slide, I think. Right. So what do other people say? I used my thoughts about this in the abstract for today, but what do we think? Why should you think, after what we've said, why should student affairs assessment leaders care about neoliberalism? We'll pause and let you put your thoughts in the box.
So please feel free to chat in some of your feedback. We have over 80 folks on the call, so I hope we can get a few comments from people.
So if you want, we can go to the next slide while people are chatting, and I'll keep talking. So one paradox of neoliberalism is that universal competition relies upon universal quantification and comparison. And the result is that workers, job seekers, and public services of every kind are subject to a regime of assessment and monitoring. Now, this is designed to identify the winners and publish the losers. So von Mises, the original liberalist thinker a long time ago, proposed to free us from this bureaucratic nightmare of central planning, but instead we've created one with these 5 tenets that are listed here. And in relation to that last bullet, the declining morality, I want to reference sociologist Emil Durkheim. He warned that the disenfranchisement of a class of people from the structures of society will produce a state of anomie, or a condition in which society provides little moral guidance to individuals. And he said, once society becomes trapped in this anomie, that we become easy prey to propaganda and emotionally driven mass movements. And I know Carrie told me this afternoon when we first started, we were glad to get away from the current situation. But this comes back to that too. It feeds into what's happening, and it feeds into this market-driven idea that it's free and just, and it will justly allocate resources. Kyle, I think you want to say something about these bullets too.
I do, yeah. So these 5 tenets are actually from a piece that Dr. Sam Musaeus, who I had mentioned earlier, published in the book Administration for Social Justice and Equity in Higher Education. And I think these tenets are really important because they're actually some of the first published scholarship around what neoliberalism is in higher education and student affairs. It's actually not a topic that has been published and researched much in our specific field. In other fields, sociology and even higher education broadly, but not necessarily in student affairs. And so I think this is important because it's some of the first scholarship out there that really tries to describe what this looks like in our field and in our context. And so it helps us kind of get on the same page about what we're talking about. And if we look at the first one, consumerism. So this is really about the value of people in our field, whether that's professionals or students, the actions that we take in higher education, the priorities that we have as institutions, as divisions of student affairs, as offices. Those things are determined by how much revenue we can make. That's really what that first bullet is about. The second bullet around competitive individualism. So competitive individualism from neoliberalism is where a culture is created in which every person prioritizes their own self-interest. That's really above all what's prioritized. Above the community, above the collective, it's about self-interest. Surveillance is the third thing. And I think it's an interesting thing, and we might get into this, but related to assessment, surveillance is about monitoring and reporting to make sure that every member of the system complies with the neoliberal values of consumerism, competitive individualism, and some of those things. So scarcity is the next one. This is about declining budgets, about declining resources, and this idea that we all feel like our work is at risk and at jeopardy of being at the chopping block. And so it's this increased need to fight for our own survival in one way or another. And the last thing around declining morality, it's about eradicating beliefs that institutions like higher education, colleges, universities have any responsibility to the public good, to the community, to the collective, and that it's all about individual interests. So I think these 5 tenets are really important because they help us kind of get on the same page about what we're talking about with neoliberalism.
So we have quite a chat going on right now. And so I will try to summarize a bit. And again, Renee is helping us with that. One of the things that we're noticing is, that as we think of the question that you all posed to us in terms of why student affairs is concerned with this, right? It helps us to recognize the limited resources. It helps us to recognize the important contextual influences, understanding the role of social capital helps us to do socially just assessment. I think It helps us to tell a better story about students that's much broader and more in depth. One comment's gotten a lot of shout out, so I want to maybe highlight from one participant. It's from Rain. It seems linked to a post-positive approach to data. Neoliberalism and capitalism encourage the reduction of our student stories and lives into data points. And so there's just been a lot of discussion in terms of, different specific things that I think we'll hope to share with our presenters, and I think that we all can kind of take in. One question that I think is also important here is, can you speak about the intersections between neoliberalism's impact on U.S. higher education and the rise of assessment culture within higher education?
Yes, and we're going to do that over the next few slides too. And if that question is not answered to your satisfaction, when we're done, we'll come back to it. But we do have that blended in, and I loved those comments because that's exactly what Kyle and I began seeing as we started going through. Because would you go to the next slide, please? Slide, please, Carrie. As I mentioned, I have a bit of a different perspective because I've worked in advanced manufacturing. And so the movement towards measuring and assessing everything has shifted the focus that we used to have. So we used to say students are customers. But now our focus is one in which students are becoming products. We still treat students as customers in the face-to-face, or as Goffman termed these, the front stage interactions. So by doing so, students acquiesce to becoming products. They don't resist. But in our backstage reality, what's happening as a result, and I think this addresses your question, in the backstage reality of a neoliberalistic framework, students are becoming widgets that we package and ship to the corporate customers. Kyle, you wanted to say something about activism while we were talking about this too, right?
Yeah, so I've noticed in the literature of higher education and student affairs, there's sort of this surge of literature around student activism. And student activism, I think, is becoming more of a central focus as a pedagogy and a way to engage students. But it's an interesting observation for me to sort of parallel student activism with neoliberalism and the forces of neoliberalism. So if you think about the students who typically are doing activism on campus, it's generally marginalized students in some way. It's students who are not being served by the institution in one way or another. And oftentimes these are marginalized students, right? Students of color, queer students, trans students. If you think about consumerism and the way that colleges and universities try to package services and, if you think about like very luxury residence halls and student unions that have, every kind of food option that might be available. These are goods and services that are really packaged for the elite, for the wealthy, and for the privileged. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that the students who are least satisfied with higher education and the goods and services that are provided by higher education are the students who don't benefit from those consumerist-oriented services. And so I think it's just another really great example of the ways that students are being treated as consumers, and then the intersection of other social identities and other systems of oppression that interact with neoliberalism.
And so I think this also answers that question. This is another part of that answer. The policies, neoliberalist policies, have been designed to heighten competition between schools. It's driven by accountability. And I'm not against accountability, don't misunderstand me, but it's driven by accountability, measurement, and comparison based on standardized measures. For example, in Australia, you've got the NA Plan network, the My School website. State dashboards here in the United States pit secondary schools against one another to hold schools accountable through publicly displaying the test data. So this promotes competition between schools. It informs and promotes parent choice. Likewise, in higher education, we have the college scorecard. We have the college navigator created by the NCES, National Center for Educational Statistics, which is based on the IPEDS data. And organizations have both of these have positive and negative effects, just like these movements On the positive side, these reforms make us more accountable. They highlight inequalities between schools. But on the negative side, they can promote things like teaching to the test. They might cause anxiety among school leaders, teachers, parents, students. And in higher ed publications like the U.S. News and World Reports, whose rankings are ostensibly based on the common data set, they're really, and I've submitted these, so I'm saying this from experience, experiential and anecdotal evidence. It's nothing more than a money-based numbers game. So Kyle, you wanted to say something here too, I believe.
Yeah, I was going to say something about competition between student affairs professionals and the way that that shows up. But actually, I want to spend a little bit of time just addressing the question about assessment and the way that this impacts assessment, because I think competition is kind of one of the biggest ways that it shows up. So because of declining budgets from state and federal entities, and because of lowered enrollment at many institutions, I think many universities are feeling pressure to really make the most of the money that they have. And a lot of that involves making sure that we're spending our resources and time and energies in ways that make sense. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, as Dr. Nix pointed out, I think making sure that we're accountable for the ways that we're using our resources is a good thing. And I think that when taken to the extreme, I think oftentimes that creates sort of a toxic competition between professionals, a toxic competition between offices, a toxic competition between student affairs and a lot of the other entities within higher education. And so it sort of eliminates this possibility for authentic and genuine collaboration, because if we see each other, if we see ourselves at odds against one another for the limited resources that are out there, then the possibility for collaboration, which I think is sort of a bedrock value and foundational value of our field, it's sort of being chipped away at because we feel the need to sort of justify what we're doing and show how it's better or more valuable than what other people are doing, more valuable and more worthy of resources. And so in some ways, I think that's a little bit of how it intersects with assessment and the call for doing more assessment.
Would you advance, please? So how have schools responded? Well, we're now governed by boards of trustees who are sometimes extremely limited in terms of their experience with higher education, but they're intent on running schools like businesses. And I didn't mention this, but I served as an interim college president. And so I have firsthand experience with boards who want to run the college like a business and have absolutely zero higher ed experience. Education is geared principally towards the needs of global capitalism rather than being something that is important for its own sake, for learning's sake. So we've raised tuition, so we've passed the burden of cost to students who now become consumers and debt holders rather than beneficiaries of enlightenment. We've entered into research partnerships with industry. We're teetering dangerously close to turning the pursuit of truth into the pursuit of profits, and we're hiring a larger and larger number of short-term, part-time adjuncts who are members of a transient and disposable workforce. So we'll go to the next slide, and I think Kyle's going to talk, but I'm going to come back to this when we get to the end and say a little bit more. You're still muted, Kyle.
So we've got a little bit of time left, and I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. But I want to focus now on not just what the problems are related to neoliberalism, but what we can do about it. So maybe in the chat box, y'all can start brainstorming, and maybe that's already been happening. But what can we do as student affairs professionals to sort of become more aware of neoliberalism and how it works in our everyday lives, and then to resist and push back against it? And I'm just going to keep on.
Actually, Kyle, if you have a second, we have quite a few questions about how this connects right now with our previous conversation, and maybe folks can chat in with this question about how, with response of COVID-19 and the scarcity of resources, is also connected to this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't know if your events want to maybe touch on that while they're responding to the question about what we can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, like Dr. Nick said, I think it's absolutely connected. I have been a little bit removed from some of those conversations because, like I said, I'm a recovering higher ed professional. But I don't know, Dr. Nix, maybe if you have some more specific thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to go back to Wendy Brown's book that I mentioned earlier, something Destroying the Demos, whatever it was called. But it's what I recommend is that everybody on this conversation today read chapters 4 and 5, if nothing else, out of that book, because what she does is trace how we have destroyed the political being. And so back to student activism, back to who does that now. Neoliberalism makes it all about individuals, my speculative worth. I'm coming to school to get this certificate so I can get a job. And so there's very little, we become an economic being rather than a political being. And so what she is going over in her thesis of that book is that we're basically destroying democracy by erasing political thought, by erasing the idea that we should have debate about what happens. Neoliberalism takes that away and says everything is dependent on the market. Everything should be market driven because that distributes resources fairly, justly, equitably, right? And so we can see right now, even though both political parties, and I'll give myself a shout out because when Kyle and I first started talking about this, my focus has been on how it's changed higher education and globalism's effect on that across the world since I've been working on, since I finished my dissertation research in China. This is the first time I've really looked at going into student affairs, and I've been an assessor for many years. So I wrote a series of blog posts, 5 blog posts, preparing myself as much as anybody else for this structured conversation so I could start to look at, well, what does that really mean to this profession? And so my last name, Nix, and then home, H-O-M-E, all one word, .com. The last 5 posts there are building up to this. And I go in and get research from other people who have talked about this. And the reason I put it in blog posts is because a lot of these things are written in research articles. And so they're not accessible to everybody. Some of the journals are behind paywalls. And so I wanted to have a series of posts so that our profession could look at, and I've got those referenced so you can look them up if you want to, but that's really what this is about. We are taking politics and the political discussion away from what happens in our day-to-day lives and replacing it with caring about speculative value of individuals.
Yeah, and if I could just sort of chime in here as well. So thinking back to the idea of students as consumers, I saw something, it was a news article of some political commentary talking head talking about how COVID-19 and the ability for higher ed to sort of almost overnight shift online has sort of demonstrated the ways that a traditional on-campus experience in college is this hoax and is a sham, and we haven't really needed it all along, and we really can just do all of our education online. And so, I think that's a really great demonstration of the misunderstanding of liberal arts education and what happens at a liberal arts institution or even a large research or a small private or a community college where, there are educational outcomes that are beyond just skill acquisition. And so I think that some of what we've seen around the conversation related to COVID-19 and this shift to online education is that, oh, well, we don't need to focus on liberal arts education anymore. We can just get students in online spaces. We can pack them in there. The more the better, and really all we have to do is deliver content. And really, in some ways, I think that sort of undermines our goals as student affairs professionals, because we're all about student development, we're all about leadership, inclusion, social justice, and those are difficult learning, or more difficult learning outcomes to achieve through online spaces. At least I think we're figuring out how to do that better as we speak, and maybe in a more forced and unplanned way than we had thought. But I do think that that's one of the challenges with this this pandemic.
So our chat is just, it's all over. So they are doing a wonderful job of a great discussion, some highlights of responses to your questions, and I think are touching on really what you were just talking about, Kyle, is the need for us to become more aware of neoliberalism and understand it and push back. Folks are giving examples of situations on their campuses where when their use of private donor money is needed, that the reduction with this reduction of state funding and the corporate strings that come with that, and how institutions are capitalizing on students to earn money and higher enrollment, and just thinking through as well, in assessment in particular, how folks gave examples, giving specific ways of when they're producing and presenting numbers, that they also always include qualitative data. Or someone said sharing the outliers of the qualitative data or outliers of the numbers, because those are also stories that often get left out. And just thinking through how folks are saying that how many students are struggling right now in response to this pandemic and that transition, right? And so being able to share in ways that can challenge some of this narrative that we can just shift everything overnight, and what you were just talking about of that blog post or that commentary on higher education's purpose, right? So thinking back again, what you said about the purpose of education, the learning outcomes tied to it, and how we can maybe center those outcomes that we are built on and what we believe to be true. But there's a lot more in that chat. That's between Renee and I summarizing and trying to pull out some nuggets. So
great. Well, I'm glad folks are talking, because that's the whole point of this. So we do have a few minutes left, and I might just kind of breeze through these last few slides. So, I think for me, if I think about what we can do, the biggest thing is about reconnecting, right? Reconnecting back to the values and the reason why we got in this field in the first place. And I realize that can be a challenge amidst all the pressures that we're talking about and thinking about. But I do think that that's the challenge that we face, is figuring out how we reconnect and do what we have set out to do as a field all along in our current circumstances. That's what evolution and adaptation is all about. And we've always been good at that, student affairs, from the very beginning. We've been leaders in how to figure out how to care for students throughout all the changes in our country's history and the world's history. And I don't think this is going to be any different than that. And so I created a model and thinking about what are some sort of tangible tools that we can use to resist neoliberalism. And they're sort of built off of mindfulness strategies and mindfulness practices. And so, the culture of neoliberalism is all about fast-paced, frenzied, not reflecting too much, and just kind of going through the motions. And so I think one of the best ways that we can resist is actually to stop, to pause, to create stillness, to rest, observe what's happening, and then reflect and take action for recovery. So the three components of the model are rest, reflection, and recovery. And like I said, I don't think we're going to come up with solutions until we sort of pause and really observe what's happening. So that's the first aspect of the model. And I really do believe that this pandemic is providing us with an opportunity to do some of this, to stop, to pause, to really observe what's happening in higher education. Is it aligned with our values as student affairs professionals? Is it aligned with the values of higher education more broadly? So that first step is just really stopping, pausing, observing. The second step is to reflect. So after you observe what's happening, reflect on how is that impacting you? How is that impacting students? How is that impacting institutions? How is that impacting the broader culture of higher education? To really think about how all of this is impacting the way that we work and operate from day to day. And then after taking some time to reflect and think about what's happening and its impact, then coming up with some strategies for how we can take action to recover. And recovery is really focused on recovering our values, recovering our purpose and the reason why we got into education in the first place, recovering our own humanity, because as Dr. Nix pointed out many times, I think that the system of neoliberalism is a very dehumanizing ism. And so being able to recover our own humanity and the humanity of our students and the humanity of our colleagues through some very intentional collaboration, through some very intentional story sharing. We'll get to some of that in a minute. I think these tools can help us. And I know it's kind of like broad and quick, but I do think that it might be one way to kind of formulate how we might start thinking about solutions to some of this.
I also wanted to talk about on the third learning outcome for today, and I'll be really brief. You noticed I put an affective learning outcome. So one of the things as an online instructor, my tactics are to coerce students to do the assigned work, which is to receive, reflect and discuss with peers, which is to respond, classify the importance of the material, which is to value, incorporate the material into what they already knew and were doing, organizing, and then tell me how they're going to change their behaviors by utilizing this new material in practice or to characterize. So that is pursuing affective learning outcomes. And I was reading the chats. This is phenomenal. I'm so happy to see this much conversation occurring around this topic. But part of you, a lot of you were saying this, that you don't turn in assessments without some qualitative data. And I was like, yes, this is exactly what one of the main things I think that we have to do. But how do I know that this is happening? I measure affective learning outcomes over a series of 3 to 5 courses within one cohort. It can't be like a cognitive learning outcome that I can, as Dr. Ashley said, just measuring one activity, and yes, we know that they've demonstrated it. But there is no instrument for this. It takes qualitative textual data analysis. That's my methodology. And through substantive effort, I'm able to show that. But there's no shortcut. How do I make the case that my efforts, the benefits of doing this, outweighs the costs that I incur? And I think that's where we, as a profession, the student affairs assessment leaders, we can start to put a little bit of pressure on the student affairs folks who develop programs to say, we have to measure things over time, not just at the initial event, but the reactions that include a series of events after that initial learning event occurs. And so the last conversation that I was in for Saul, we talked about co-curricular records, and I think that's a great thing. It is a neoliberal construct because we're looking at speculative value, but we can also incorporate some qualitative assessments into long-term what students have when they graduate. Kyle, you want to wrap up here?
Yeah, so my research, for my methodology in my dissertation, I used critical participatory action research. And I actually think that participatory action research in general, is a really underutilized methodology for scholars. But I also think it's a tool that we can use as student affairs assessment leaders to do really helpful assessment work, gather data, and to involve students. So action research is all about involving the participants in the assessment process. And so I think that actually one of the big tools that we can use to push back against neoliberalism and to continue doing the work that we have set out to do and that got us into student affairs in the first place is to involve students in the process of telling the stories, right? Involve students in the process of collecting data and telling the story of how the services are being provided, the impact of the services. Because once the students have ownership, not only is the data richer and tells a better story, but then the students are involved, and so they're invested and they care. And as we all know, when students are involved, things happen, right? You know, folks are much more likely to respond and provide solutions when students are the ones sort of backing and asking for things rather than when it just comes from us. So that's one more thing that I would add in terms of assessment. I'll end there. I know we're over time, and I'm sure there's lots of questions out there. But I'm just so grateful for everybody for being on the call, for engaging in conversation, and I hope it continues forward from here because there's lots to explore and lots to uncover.
And I want to say one more thing, in case you get a chance or are interested in reading the 5 blog posts I wrote. When I ended those, I intentionally, and I wanted to bring this up today, I intentionally left that as a dichotomous choice. But we don't have to choose between one or the other. And I think because of us, because of who we are in student affairs, we are the most uniquely and well-positioned group of professionals to actually blend those approaches. We can incorporate emotions, democratic ideals into also preparing people for job markets and being better at what they're going to do when they graduate. But I think we have become tilted towards the latter. And I think that's why this conversation is so important. We have to start trying to rebalance that. And I echo what Dr. Ashley said. Thank you all for joining us today. And it's been wonderful seeing the comments. Carrie, I'm done.
Yeah, I have facilitated a lot of structured conversations, and this has probably been the most active chat. So I think it really brought forth folks. I think a lot of folks were thinking in the way that you were just sharing, Kyle, in terms of kind of pausing and thinking about it, right? And reflecting on the nature of our work and what we are doing in ways that maybe we and or our folks and our colleagues are asking us to kind of buy into that. And how do we kind of challenge that and get back to the learning and the purpose of student affairs assessment work broadly, right? So one thing, I know we're over time, so I haven't seen so many questions at this point. So I think based on the folks that are having to drop off, I'm sure everyone has other Zoom calls. I will share that I do have some resources from Dr. Nix and Dr. Ashley that we will work to share. And I also will work with both of them to get some of the other books and things that they cited and Vince's blog. And we'll send that out to everyone as well, because I think there were some great resources for us to consider as we're thinking about neoliberalism in student affairs and education. So at this time,
Carrie,
yes.
Real quickly, would you go down to the references? I saw somebody in the chat ask for that book. I did put that on the
in the references. I'll chat that in right now, and then I will send
I've got one more slide.
Perfect.
Yeah, there's another slide with it there. It's after that, I think.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
there we go. It's Brown, 2015.
Brown, perfect.
The demos. Right.
So we'll send this slideshow out that has these references, but then we'll also link to some of the other resources that you mentioned, Vince. I know particularly your blog, and we'll check and make sure we have everything. And at this point, we will wrap up. So I really want to thank Dr. Nix and Dr. Ashley for a wonderful structured conversation. It was just a great dynamic conversation, and the chat window was phenomenal. And so thank you both for your time and your sharing of your expertise. And just as a reminder, this is a part of our SAL Professional Development Committee, and we will be sharing the recording of this via email as well on our YouTube page. And thank you, and we hope you all have a great day. And we'll be in touch soon with structured conversations coming out in the next couple of months. Thank you. Oh, Vince's blog, he shared it. He's already ahead of the game. So we will share all those things. Thank you.